Good afternoon, everyone. As we wind down another full day of our Future of Health Summit, I hope each of you has found insight and inspiration, not only from our amazing speakers, but also from each other. At every Milken Institute event, we seek to provide not just ideas, but ideas that can be translated into action. All of you are leaders in health and healthcare, and we hope you'll leave the summit both with ideas that can animate your work each day and with new connections that can help as we all work to address the world's health needs. The theme of this year's conference is simple and direct: closing the gap, better health for more people. It highlights what is the most urgent need in health, especially in this country: widening access to health care, extending and improving well-being for all. The numbers and statistics on widening inequities in healthcare are stark and have been highlighted and I know deeply discussed in the last 2 days. These gaps need to be narrowed and one day closed. But here's the good news: they can be. Yes, it requires resources, focus, and will, but breakthroughs and rapid innovations in medicines, vaccines, diagnostics, new ways of care delivery, overlaid with the new and heady promise of AI, give us the real prospect of boosting lifespans and quality of lives across all communities and all continents. The session will begin in a few minutes, moderated by the founding head of Faster Cures, Greg Simon, will help us understand and prepare for the next century of health. But for our first sparks of inspiration and insight, we are delighted to welcome the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Robert Califf, in conversation with Executive Vice President of MI Health and a wonderful colleague, Esther Kofa. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Califf and Esther. Thank you.
All right. Rob, we have so much to talk about, and of course you're a man who needs no introduction, and all of us are quite familiar with both your first stint and now your second stint at FDA. As Conrad just mentioned, our theme for this conference is focused on closing the gap, better health for more people. And yesterday, I started off the conference with a conversation that is very much close to what you've been focused on and working on, or at least helping the ecosystem grapple with, which is this issue around life expectancy in the US. The data, of course, are evident that life expectancy is declining, the shortest it's been in over 2 decades. We're at 76.4 years. We talked about how we're spending the most of high-income countries on health with the worst health outcomes, and that we're in this epidemic of chronic disease. From your vantage point, of course, at FDA, you're squarely focused, laser-eyed focused on evidence generation. And the idea being, how do we develop better medicines, better products, better evidence in order to make clinical decisions that can ultimately help us achieve better health outcomes? So can you tell us a little bit about your perspective with how do we tie this conversation of the life expectancy, poor health outcomes, to your focus on evidence generation?
That's a great question, and it's one I've actually struggled with a lot, because you don't have to be too smart to look at the data and see that we are doing that while many other societies are doing that. I was in Singapore last month. They're about to hit 85 for life expectancy. That's a full decade, and we're headed in opposite directions. So it's a big problem. The easy thing to do is to say, well, it's really delivery. It has nothing to do with the FDA, actually, because FDA does innovation and new products and those sorts of evaluations. And you could also say it has nothing to do with evidence generation. The rest of the other high-income countries have the same evidence we have, and they have substantially higher life expectancy. But saying those things is too easy. We never do it the easy way in the US. And so I think, I heard you talked about the Washington Post articles, that I'm not a salesperson for the Washington Post, but I think these are fabulous articles. And it's a bit of a struggle right now, honestly, to figure out how to get people lit up about this. Um, when you talk about cures, that's a good metaphor. People are very excited. Talk about declining life expectancy. It's sort of an abstract thing. But I think the key to it was in the second Washington Post article about the 3 counties along Lake Erie. 3 counties, basically the same demographics of the population, 3 different sets of health policies, very significant differences in life expectancy, but in 3 different states that have 3 different sets of policies. But what's behind all that is, it's a very fundamental thing that I learned early in my career in running intensive care units. You think you have a great idea, you need to prove it in adequate clinical studies, most often a randomized trial, I would say. And after you've proven it, then you need to implement it. And if you do, the outcomes get better. That's really what the article pointed out quite clearly. And so now let me bring that back to the FDA. Although I know traditionally this meeting has been focused on cures with new therapies, I'm all for that. I'm proud of the fact that everywhere in the world I go, people say the FDA is the best. The U.S. is far and away the leader in innovation. We don't want to back off on that at all. But I would argue that the phase 1, 2, 3 and variations of it that we use to move things along, it works pretty darn well. But when things go on the market, we have no system to generate the evidence that we need to know what to do. So we have all these questions that are left on the table, like which is better? What really is the right dose? What are the subpopulations where the benefits really outweigh the risk? How do we combine the therapies? How long should we give it? None of those questions are answered for almost all drugs or devices that come on the market approved by the FDA. The FDA is tasked by law with saying this is safe and effective for a particular indication in a particular population. That's what you need to prove. Then the label gets written. And we need an evidence generation system for the post-market phase. But of course, that's not the FDA's primary mission. And so that will take an ecosystem and a community, which I know is something that you've been working on. I do want to say that one part of this is really important. If you picked out the most important remediable predictors of death in the U.S., it's tobacco and hypertension. We think we've conquered tobacco. We're going to lose 460,000 Americans this year from tobacco-related illness. And we have millions of teenagers getting addicted to nicotine through vaping right now. So there the FDA has a primary role in nutrition. I've been reading a lot about ultra-processed foods. There's an argument going on. The FDA doesn't act in something like this unless there's definitive evidence. But I would argue for things like nutrition, that same evidence generation system that would be good for post-market drugs, let me just throw in dietary supplements into that. If you could do these studies at a low cost and get the answers, we'd know what to do. Of course, then there's a second step. Will the policymakers actually pay attention to the evidence and put into place policies that reflect that evidence? And there we got a lot of problems in this country also.
Yes, well, it's helpful for us to recognize that your plate at FDA is broader than just the medicines and the product development. And you've talked about tobacco, you've talked about the food side. Maybe just a few hours ago, your colleague, Monica Bertagnoli, was just confirmed as the new NIH director, so we're all pleased to hear that. And obviously, that's going to also play into what you just talked about, which is it's not just the FDA that's responsible for that post-market evidence generation. We certainly have NIH that's even further upstream. But the collective entities within the HHS body of agencies, FDA, CDC, NIH, together can make a collective difference. So how do you think you can work with Monica and other colleagues on this question of can we revamp in the post-market where we really need to know clear information around the right interventions for the right patients at the right time for us to make traction and make a difference in this issue?
Yeah, let's not forget the big gorilla, CMS, which is dwarfs
and CMS,
all the rest
of course,
of us
absolutely.
in terms of
yes.
total budget. So I think I've sort of been waiting on Monica to get confirmed. You know that we've worked together and gotten to know each other well. I've got a little brother with cancer right now. She's been a tremendous personal help, and so I've been able to see the heart and grit that she has. I think to be a cancer surgeon, you sort of have to be tough. So, I look at this thing and I say, okay, we're leading the world far and away. No one's even close in innovation. We're last among high-income countries in health outcomes right now. Last. It's unfathomable to me. I'm used to being a winner in first place, and I'm a sports person. We need to generate that evidence, and we all need to play a role. Like, what are the little things CMS can do on a grand scale to encourage clinicians to participate in research? What are things NIH can do to change its portfolio just enough that our mammoth academic medical centers pay more attention to the kinds of clinical studies that really make a difference for health outcomes? And then across the board, you've worked on this, the use of AI and virtual methodologies to reach people who right now have a hard time getting to the clinic or the research clinic to generate that evidence. So I think we've got to have that target, and we all need to be focused on it. We're doing a little exercise now. I think if you looked in sum at what all the federal agencies and all the voluntary agencies and foundations are putting into what I would call a post-market system, it's a lot of money, but it's not directed towards a common goal or a system. Another way of saying it, which you've heard me say before, I think, why did I have to call Israel to figure out what to do with the vaccine after the next update was given? They have an electronic health record system where it's pretty much real time for the clinical outcomes. Why did the UK have to get its system together and do clinical trials in the context of healthcare delivery that rapidly got the real answers that we need? Were these COVID drugs reducing or increasing the mortality? We spent a lot of time in the US doing a whole bunch of little studies and writing all kinds of papers, most of which were inaccurate because they didn't have randomization and you couldn't really infer causality. And we did a lot of elegant science. We've got to devote some of that effort to getting the answers that people need.
That's right. I mean, I think you're seeing the fragmentation of the U.S. healthcare system play out in real time in that exact situation with the examples you pointed out to with both Israel and the UK, and perhaps we're in a unique opportunity to solve for that. I want to turn a bit now to another topic on misinformation. And can we make a connection between misinformation, what's happening on health outcomes from your perspective, but also what is the role of FDA in encouraging more of the public to trust the decisions that are made across the board, right, both on the food side as well as on the medical product side? Because what we're seeing, of course, as you know very well, is that trust in institutions, and especially public health institutions, and science is decreasing. It's actually not getting better since COVID. You've been talking about this, but what's FDA doing uniquely differently that it's a priority for you?
Well, I'll try to make 3 quick points. I know we have limited time. We could talk about this for a long time. Number one, we have to up our game at the FDA in terms of speaking to people in plain English or Spanish or whatever language that they can understand, rather than speaking in the way we're used to speaking in the past, which is speaking to doctors or the industries that we regulate. People don't understand well what the FDA does. So we'll do that to the best we possibly can. And there's a Reagan-Udall Foundation report I would refer people to that just came out that lays that out. But then we've got to really depend on non-government entities to pick up their game too. I think, I'm not defeatist. We're going to keep trying within FDA and within government. But the reality is that the misinformation purveyors are at it 24/7. We have jobs to do. Our communication budget is very limited. We have great communication people who are here, but there are just a few of them relative to the vast expanse of the internet out there. So we need consortia out in the real world, universities, medical centers, industry, voluntary foundations, to create a network that's devoted to promoting the truth. The third thing I'd say is I do think I'm swung over now that fighting misinformation is actually probably going to be an unsuccessful strategy. But one thing I learned in my work at Alphabet, I think I learned this correctly, the biggest single factor is just how much people hear of one part of it. So the example I'll use, if we put out one press release, that may have a huge impact on the industry, the stock price, whatever. But what the public is hearing is 24/7 counter messaging. And so that means you got to have the share of that voice reaching people in the way they're used to getting information if you're going to change it and gain trust. And so that network that's involved needs to be very personal. It needs to be in the community, interacting with people in a way that they can best receive information.
Well, I think you gave us a very specific idea there, which is a call to action around creating these coalitions from the ground up. And there's so many in the audience today that can take that forward. I want to talk about RWE, RWD, and its evolution over time. We had a fantastic session yesterday where we talked about, is the public on board with new models for drug development that incorporates the use of real-world data and real-world evidence. And you've talked about, certainly with CDRH leading the way, leveraging real-world evidence for potentially label expansion. But I actually want to ask you something a little bit differently, which is, what are people not asking you about RWD and RWE that you think they ought to know? And it's critical for this evolution and certainly in the drug development decision-making. What should we know?
Well, I mean, here I go, my broken record again. The answer's been the same for me for 35 years. I think what people are doing is when they hear real world, they assume that means sloppy information put together post hoc in some way to try to derive a conclusion that you can't really draw. That was like 95% of the papers written about COVID therapeutics. We can do better than that. And so real world data, I've used it my whole career for regulatory purposes. The early heart attack trials, people came into emergency rooms, nurses and doctors checked a few forms about what was happening with the patient, stuck it in a fax machine. We were randomizing 20 to 40,000 patients per trial. FDA was totally behind it. It got indications, et cetera. So this is nothing new. But what people don't think about enough is that real-world data is just the source of the data. Real-world evidence is defined by applying a method to the data. And I think the thing people neglect the most is that randomization is still the best method if your purpose is to know if a treatment has an effect. Because we've come a long way in terms of confounding adjustment and methods for that. The time zero bias and a lot of things that we deal with, we don't have good solutions to that. So real-world evidence includes randomization using real-world data.
And can AI play a role in that? I think there are so many solutions that are emerging in AI for drug development, AI in healthcare, AI in helping with administrative burden for physicians. As you think about even expanding what you talked about, RWD is nothing new, RWE obviously needs to be at this level of quality and rigor, and we're looking at potentially new tools that, can we trust it? Does it provide high quality data that can potentially feed into the level of evidence that FDA would need? What's the role of AI in that conversation of RWD and RWE?
Let's set aside generative AI for just a moment. If we're just talking about predictive AI, I think it's no different in its fundamentals than any algorithm applied in healthcare or medicine. And I think, to me, the most important thing for people to know, and it's, in my view, a total failing of the American healthcare system, you said it, it's fragmented. So if you don't believe that, try to get data that follows a patient over time for a lifetime without having to pay a fortune to a data aggregator who's working around the system because the system doesn't work. And so if you stick an AI algorithm in a living system, like a health system, to make predictions, and then you walk away, a year later, it's not going to be very good. And you don't know if it's why it's not good. You need to be able to constantly monitor and tune the algorithm over time. To do that, you need a health system that actually can follow people with relevant data. So you begin to see how this post-market evidence generation system fits together. Can you trust AI? I wouldn't trust it if it's just stuck in a system and people tell you, we've developed it 2 years ago, it's going to be great for you. I would not trust that. I think it's dangerous. And so we need transparency, and we need a community that monitors this for the benefit of patients. But is AI going to be useful? It's going to be useful for everything. And generative AI, it's very exciting, but we have a whole other discussion about how to regulate that. It's really complicated. My greatest hope is that, at least relatively quickly, clinical people will be freed up to actually interact with patients, which it's just disastrous what's happened at this point where when you watch clinicians at work, they're mostly checking billing forms and trying to get their electronic records correct. And I'm very high on things that EHR companies and AI companies are talking about, where you'll have an assistant that takes care of the stuff that a machine can do as well as a human. So the human can do the human things.
Well, the ability for us to restore that physician-patient interaction with taking things off of the physician, with charting, for example, all of those tools, I think, are going to be tremendously helpful for what we want to see in terms of the healthcare system. We are out of time. We're going to wrap up here. There's so much else I would love to ask you, but thank you so much for spending time with us, and have a great panel, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.